En los próximos años veremos una explosión de la exploración del espacio llevada a cabo no solo por agencias espaciales, sino también por industrias privadas. Bases en la Luna, estaciones espaciales para uso turístico y finalmente la colonización de Marte son unos de los desafíos que veremos en los próximos años. Pero, ¿estamos preparados físicamente para salir de la protección que nos brinda nuestro planeta? Para obtener esa respuesta, estamos con Susan Bailey. Susan es profesora de la Universidad de Colorado en los Estados Unidos y también trabaja con la NASA para conocer cómo los viajes espaciales de larga duración afectan nuestro cuerpo. Hi Susan, thank you for joining us. Based on your knowledge and your studies with the Kelly twin astronauts, how does long-term space travel affect our body?
Well, thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to join you today and talk about the twin study. The twin study was really a really remarkable opportunity to study the effects of long-duration spaceflight on human health. We had the twins, Scott and Mark Kelly, identical twin brothers who had both been former astronauts and Navy test pilots, so they were very similar in nature and nurture. So we had a great opportunity to study one of the twins, Scott Kelly, during a year in space, as well as then Mark Kelly spending that same year on the ground. We also got samples before, during, and after the one-year mission, or the twins, which became known as the twin study. So we really were able to identify space-specific factors that influence the various endpoints that we studied. And that was interesting too, because it was the first time that NASA really did any kinds of omics-based studies. So things like genomics, where they sequenced DNA, or transcriptomics, where they sequenced RNA. They also did proteomics, looking at proteins, metabolomics, looked at the microbiome, cognition, and in addition to all the standard things that they analyzed. And, you know, it was really one of the main conclusions was that the human body is really remarkably adaptable to spaceflight, at least, you know, for up to a year in space, because most of the endpoints that we studied returned to normal or baseline not long after return to Earth. So some of them took, you know, 3 days or a few hours, and up to 6 to 9 months after the study. So many of them did return to normal. But some of the things, of course, that we think about during spaceflight is the effect of microgravity, living in a microgravity environment. And we've known for a long time things like muscle wasting and bone loss are a big concern. So, you know, they have a lot of exercise equipment on the International Space Station to help combat that. But again, as we go beyond the space station, we'll have to think about how to mitigate that. Another really common thing that happens is fluid shifts. So because gravity is not pulling down on their bodies and the fluids in the body, they tend to shift upwards. So that's why astronauts often look kind of puffy, and they have increased cranial pressure, often have headaches or even vision problems that sometimes last after space flight as well. So that's something that they need to think about. And some of the more longer lasting effects can be things like cognitive decline. Certainly Scott Kelly did have some cognitive decline that lasted, you know, well into 9 months after he returned. His autobiography, his book, Endurance, is one. He even talks about how he didn't feel like himself for at least, you know, 8 to 9 months after he returned. So those kinds of things do take a little longer. Our study our part of the twin study was looking at a biological marker of age or aging. So we evaluated telomere length before, during, and after spaceflight. So this idea of how spaceflight changed those dynamics, and found that, in fact, telomere length was longer during spaceflight, but then at the end, well, you know, after spaceflight, they ended up with many more short telomeres than they started with. And so there can be some long-term health implications for that as well. But that's kind of a quick overview of a number of the studies that we did as part of the twin study.
Why does space change our DNA?
Yeah, so that's a very interesting question, and it can change DNA on a number of levels. There were reports that even kind of fake news, if you will, that Scott Kelly returned as a space mutant, which would imply that his DNA was mutated. And certainly there were some changes, but they went back to normal. What didn't go completely back to baseline was this idea of gene expression. So the proteins that are made from the DNA, some of those did not go back to baseline within the length of the study. So, that it's changing methylation patterns on the DNA, which is a very different thing than actually mutating the DNA. We did find, a part of our study, we also looked at chromosome aberrations or rearrangements. So DNA being damaged by radiation, which is probably what was causing a lot of these issues with the DNA. Actually breaks the DNA and chromosomes will rearrange. And some of those rearrangements were persistent. They lasted longer than, out to 9 months to a year after space flight. So we know that there are some effects to DNA, some of them, of course, related to radiation exposure, one of the main hazards of space flight. But it really wasn't. It also seems to influence gene expression.
There's any way we can protect ourselves from the effects of long-term space travel?
Well, I think again we've just talked about one of the major hazards of space flight, and that would be space radiation exposure, and a lot of that, especially as we think about going further and further away from the Earth, because the Earth and its atmosphere and the magnetosphere really protects us from some of the space radiation, the more damaging types. So as we go further and stay longer in outer space, astronauts are going to be exposed to much more radiation exposure, and they're going to much more damaging types of radiation exposure. So those, would certainly be an example of something that we really do have to learn how to mitigate better, because things, again, like that, concrete and water and lead that we use to shield radiation on Earth just isn't going to work during space flight. It's too heavy. So these are things that we really do have to be working on and considering how we're going to actually, deal with these hazards. And there's other things too. There's the microgravity, as we already talked about. There's altered atmospheres, so there's increased levels of CO2 in these closed and often rather hostile environments. Isolation and confinement are also a real challenge, as is the distance from the Earth. That again just presents a lot of really unique challenges and stresses. Medical care will be a problem. Resupply, that we do now a lot with some of these cargo vehicles from SpaceX, for example, that take supplies back and forth between the space station and the Earth. These things won't be possible for really long duration flights or ones that are on the moon or onto Mars. So these are things that we're going to have to learn how to deal with. But it highlights how important it is that the research that's being done and needs to continue so that we know how to deal with these things.
The idea of colonizing Mars involves the reproduction of the human species locally there on Mars. Is this possible? Can human babies born on Mars?
That's a very interesting question, isn't it? And it's certainly one that people have thought about, because at some point survival of the human race may well depend on our ability to colonize other planets, and it would require reproduction. However, really very little is known about the feasibility of reproduction in space. But one thing is for sure, that we know for sure, is that it will require men and women. And while, as far as we know, no one has ever admitted to having sex in space. We know that there has been a lot of reproduction on board the ISS in everything from fruit flies to fish and a whole range of different animals. But usually, too, it occurs by in vitro fertilization of a sperm and an egg. And so they're at least fairly certain that the early stages of reproduction are possible in space. However, some studies actually suggest that the microgravity environment may slow development of the embryo. So, these things are very important that we need to know more about and move into humans and understand, what about reproduction of humans. So certainly, other considerations for humans would include things like the increased radiation exposure that we've talked about certainly can influence fertility, as can increasing age. So all of these things really need to be considered, and there's just certainly still a whole lot we need to learn about reproduction in space, especially as we think about humans.
Thinking now in space tourism, and people going to space stations for a few days to have some time. This will be for everybody. Is there any physical issues that can affect the travelers?
Yes, isn't that interesting? Thinking about even space tourism. It's just amazing to me to even think about such a thing. But it's happening. I mean, it really is happening. And I think that certainly we have evidence that short duration space flight has very minimal risk associated with it. We think about just recently, William Shatner or Captain Kirk from Star Trek, went up on a Blue Origin rocket, and he was officially in space for 3 minutes. And as the oldest astronaut, he was 90 years old, when he did that. We also saw the first all-civilian crew, the Inspiration 4 crew that SpaceX flew, and they were, all civilians, relatively untrained, men, women, different ages. One of them was a cancer survivor, and they were up there for three days. So I think certainly those types of flights are going to be more and more feasible and possible. And I think space tourism is going to become a thing, and I'm hoping that it's not just going to be the rich and famous that can do that. But it does seem like there have to be some minimal health requirements that you have to be healthy and able to make the flight. But certainly they're opening up space to many more individuals, which is exciting.
Professor Bailey, thanks a lot for your time, for joining us here. El futuro, los viajes espaciales, son un desafío mucho más allá de lo tecnológico, un desafío para el cuerpo humano, y las respuestas a esas preguntas están en camino.